Imagine a group of people who, for centuries, lived on the margins of the great biblical narratives, carrying with them a complex history of identity and resistance. Today, we will explore the origin and conflicts of the Samaritans, a people who, despite their small presence in the modern world, hold one of the most fascinating and controversial stories in the Middle East. To understand this age-old conflict between the Samaritans and the Jews, we need to go back in time and unravel how it all began. Who were the Samaritans? Why was there such deep hatred between them and the Jews for so long? This is the story of a people who claim their descent from biblical tribes, but whose faith and customs put them on a collision course with traditional Judaism. It's a story of faith, divisions, and survival that persists today in a small and nearly extinct group living in Israel. Get ready to dive into a story that blends religion, politics, and power as we uncover the origins of the Samaritans and the impact that this small community has had and still has on the history of the people of Israel. The Samaritans claim to be direct descendants of some of the most important tribes of Israel: Manasseh, Ephraim, Levi, and, according to some versions, even the tribe of Benjamin. This origin, which they take pride in, is the foundation of their identity and faith. However, this claim has always sparked controversies and conflicts with the Jews. According to Samaritan tradition, their ancestors were Israelites who never strayed from God's ways, remaining faithful to the scriptures even when the rest of the people began following other leaders and customs. They saw themselves as the true guardians of the Torah, those who never abandoned the traditions received from the time of Moses. But this assertion brought about divisions. The Jews viewed them as imposters, as people who mingled with foreign populations during the times of exile and lost the purity of the Israelite faith. To the Jews, the Samaritans were a mixed group, with questionable lineage and religious practices considered heretical. These differences regarding who the Samaritans really were and where they came from became the basis for centuries of mutual distrust and hatred. From here, this identity difference continued to fuel the distance between the two peoples, creating a rivalry that would persist across generations. Thus begins the complex history of a people who, even today, carry this legacy of questions about their origin and legitimacy, living in the shadow of Judaism's main narrative, yet holding firm in their conviction of being the true heirs of Israel's faith. The true rupture between Jews and Samaritans occurred during the time of the prophet Eli, and the central issue revolved around a crucial point for both peoples: where should God's temple be located? The Jews, led by Eli and later by the prophet Samuel, believed that the tabernacle, the portable sanctuary where the Ark of the Covenant rested, should be in Shiloh. For them, this was the place chosen by God to be the center of worship and sacrifices. But the Samaritans had a completely different view. For them, the sacred place par excellence was not in Shiloh, and certainly not in Jerusalem, which would later become the religious capital for the Jews. The true place chosen by God, according to the Samaritans, was Mount Gerizim, beside the city of Nablus, in the heart of ancient Samaria. This disagreement was not just about geography, it touched the core of the religious beliefs and practices of both peoples. While the Jews claimed that the temple should be built in Jerusalem, the Samaritans argued that God had already designated Mount Gerizim as the sacred place through the blessings proclaimed by Moses and Joshua. They asserted that at that crucial moment when the people of Israel entered the Promised Land, the blessings pronounced on Mount Gerizim were proof that this should be the center of worship. This divergence over the holiest site marked the beginning of a dispute that would deepen over the centuries, becoming one of the greatest sources of rivalry and resentment between Jews and Samaritans. More than a simple theological difference, this issue came to symbolize who truly was the chosen people, and which lineage was in communion with the true will of God. And so, with this initial division, the seeds of a bitter conflict were planted, and the distance between these two communities would only grow from that point onward. The Samaritans adhered to a fundamental principle: the literal interpretation of the scriptures. For them, any idea or tradition not clearly written in the sacred text was rejected. While the Jews relied on a rich oral tradition that complemented and explained the Torah, the Samaritans refused to accept any interpretation beyond what was literally in the text. This focus on the direct reading of the Bible created a very different perspective on faith. The Samaritans believed they were preserving the purity of religion, not allowing external customs or traditions to corrupt the true meaning of the scriptures. For them, anything not explicitly mentioned in the sacred text was a distortion. This led to profound differences in religious practices, such as the way sacrifices were conducted, ceremonies were held, and even how certain commandments were interpreted. The oral tradition, which was an indispensable part of the faith for the Jews, was seen by the Samaritans as a human innovation, an addition they considered unnecessary and dangerous. This contrast between a literalist interpretation and one that embraced oral tradition only widened the gap between Samaritans and Jews. For the Samaritans, any practice that could not be directly justified by the letter of the Torah was illegitimate. On the other hand, for the Jews, this view was seen as limited and misguided, ignoring the richness and depth that oral tradition brought to the understanding of the scriptures. This insistence on a strictly literal reading became one of the pillars of Samaritan identity and a point of pride for them. But at the same time, it was one of the main factors that further distanced them from the Jews, creating an almost insurmountable barrier between the two communities. Over time, this ideological division led to an even more serious issue: the alteration of sacred texts. The Samaritans believed that they possessed the original and uncorrupted version of the Torah, but this original version was, in fact, an interpretation adapted to justify their beliefs and practices. According to the Samaritans, their Torah was the pure and authentic form of what Moses had transmitted to the people of Israel. However, scholars and archaeologists have discovered that this version contains significant differences from the text accepted by the Jews. Some verses were adjusted, place names were altered, and, of course, the location of the temple was identified as Mount Gerizim. These alterations were more than just minor details. They formed the foundation for the entire belief system of the Samaritans. They needed the biblical text to confirm their traditions, and to achieve this, they made changes that supported their claims. This new version of the Torah, according to them, was the true text, free from the corruptions that, in the Samaritan view, the Jews had introduced to justify their practices. What makes this issue even more interesting is that the Samaritans were not the only ones to follow this path. In another part of the ancient world, the Essenes, a dissident Jewish group who lived in the desert of Qumran, also modified their scriptures to align with their beliefs. This trend can be observed in the famous Dead Sea Scrolls, where some texts were adjusted to fit the theological vision of the Essenes. The history of the Samaritans takes a dramatic turn with a curious, and in some ways, unsettling episode. Amid Assyrian rule, something strange began to happen in the land of Samaria. According to the Bible, the powerful king of Assyria conquered several regions, and as part of his strategy to maintain control, he relocated entire populations from one place to another, mixing cultures and traditions. This is exactly what happened in Samaria. The Assyrians brought a people from a city called Cutha to live there. These new inhabitants were far from knowing the God of Israel and began to worship their own idols in the land of the Samaritans. But something unexpected happened. Wild lions began to attack the region, killing many of these settlers. They interpreted this disaster as a divine sign, believing that the local god, the God of Israel, was furious because they were not following his commandments. Desperate, the new inhabitants sought help from the Assyrians to learn how they could appease this god. The solution? Bring in Israelite priests to teach them the customs of the land. This was the beginning of a conversion that initially seemed genuine. They learned about the laws of Moses and began to follow Jewish rituals. It seemed like they were becoming part of the people of Israel. But there was a deep problem. This conversion was never complete. Even after adopting some Jewish customs, they continued practicing idolatry and worshiping their pagan gods. They were torn between two realities: the God of Israel and the ancient gods they had brought with them. This blend of beliefs and practices created a religious identity that was ambiguous and confused. When the Jews realized that this conversion was merely superficial, they quickly began to reject the Samaritans as legitimate members of the people of Israel. To the Jews, what had occurred in Samaria was not a true conversion, but an attempt to avoid divine wrath while still clinging to their old customs. This rejection marked the beginning of a mistrust that would deepen over the centuries. This episode sheds light on what became one of the greatest obstacles in the relationship between Jews and Samaritans: the perception that the faith of the Samaritans was, from the beginning, a divided commitment, based more on fear and convenience than on true devotion to the God of Israel. From that point on, the Samaritans would be seen as half-converted, as those who, despite attempting to draw near, could never be fully accepted into the Jewish community. As the centuries passed, the relationship between Jews and Samaritans not only remained tense, it became a true rivalry filled with hostility. As time went on, the Samaritans began to ally themselves with the enemies of the Jews, creating an atmosphere of constant conflict and betrayal. One of the most critical moments of this tension occurred during the Second Temple period, when the Jews, after returning from exile in Babylon, began to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah. At this point, an important figure emerged: Sanballat, a Samaritan leader who fiercely opposed the reconstruction. He did not want Jerusalem to once again become the center of worship and, along with other opponents, tried in every possible way to hinder the progress of the work. His goal was clear: to weaken the Jews and ensure that the center of worship would be on Mount Gerizim, not in Jerusalem. But this was not the only time the Samaritans positioned themselves against the Jews. When the Greeks, led by Alexander the Great, conquered the region, the Samaritans quickly allied themselves with the invaders. They asked Alexander to destroy Jerusalem and transfer religious power to their own sacred mountain. This action further solidified the distrust and disdain that the Jews felt toward the Samaritans. Josephus Flavius, the first-century Jewish historian, reports an interesting fact. He says that the Samaritans were like chameleons. When the Jews were in high standing, with prestige and recognition, the Samaritans claimed to be descendants of the tribes of Israel, trying to benefit from their good reputation. But when the Jews faced difficulties, such as persecutions or crises, the Samaritans quickly distanced themselves, denying any connection to Israel, and in some cases, even joining the enemies of the Jews. This double stance created a negative image of the Samaritans in the eyes of the Jews, who saw them as opportunistic and treacherous. The height of this animosity came during the Bar Kokhba revolt, when the Jews fought against Roman rule. While the Jews gave their lives to regain independence, the Samaritans hoped that the Romans would prevail. These historical episodes show that the conflict was not just theological or spiritual, it was also political, marked by interests and volatile loyalties. With each new generation, the hatred between the two groups was renewed, fueled by acts of betrayal, distrust, and attempts to erase the other's existence. Ultimately, what was established was a rivalry that went far beyond religion. It was a dispute over the right to be the true people of God and the guardian of the faith. As the centuries passed, the relationship between Jews and Samaritans not only remained tense, it became a true rivalry filled with hostility. As time went on, the Samaritans began to ally themselves with the enemies of the Jews, creating an atmosphere of constant conflict and betrayal. One of the most critical moments of this tension occurred during the Second Temple period, when the Jews, after returning from exile in Babylon, began to rebuild Jerusalem and the temple under the leadership of Ezra and Nehemiah. At this point, an important figure emerged: Sanballat, a Samaritan leader who fiercely opposed the reconstruction. He did not want Jerusalem to once again become the center of worship, and, along with other opponents, tried in every possible way to hinder the progress of the work. His goal was clear: to weaken the Jews and ensure that the center of worship would be on Mount Gerizim, not in Jerusalem. But this was not the only time the Samaritans positioned themselves against the Jews. When the Greeks, led by Alexander the Great, conquered the region, the Samaritans quickly allied themselves with the invaders. They asked Alexander to destroy Jerusalem and transfer religious power to their own sacred mountain. This action further solidified the distrust and disdain that the Jews felt toward the Samaritans. Josephus Flavius, the first-century Jewish historian, reports an interesting fact. He says that the Samaritans were like chameleons. When the Jews were in high standing, with prestige and recognition, the Samaritans claimed to be descendants of the tribes of Israel, trying to benefit from their good reputation. But when the Jews faced difficulties, such as persecutions or crises, the Samaritans quickly distanced themselves, denying any connection to Israel and, in some cases, even joining the enemies of the Jews. This double stance created a negative image of the Samaritans in the eyes of the Jews, who saw them as opportunistic and treacherous. The height of this animosity came during the Bar Kokhba revolt, when the Jews fought against Roman rule. While the Jews gave their lives to regain independence, the Samaritans hoped that the Romans would prevail. These historical episodes show that the conflict was not just theological or spiritual, it was also political, marked by interests and volatile loyalties. With each new generation, the hatred between the two groups was renewed, fueled by acts of betrayal, distrust, and attempts to erase the other's existence. Ultimately, what was established was a rivalry that went far beyond religion. It was a dispute over the right to be the true people of God and the guardian of the faith. To understand the complexity of this rivalry between Jews and Samaritans, we need to pay attention to the account of one of the greatest historians of antiquity, Josephus Flavius. He gives us a deep and even provocative insight into who the Samaritans really were and how they behaved over time. Josephus describes the Samaritans as a people who lived with a constant dual identity. When the tide was in favor of the Jews, whether through prosperity or good relations with surrounding empires, the Samaritans quickly claimed their descent from the tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh. They presented themselves as part of the people of Israel, trying to reap the benefits of a positive association with the Jews. But when circumstances changed, when the Jews were persecuted or found themselves in a disadvantaged position, the Samaritans denied any connection with Israel. They claimed they were not Jews, that they had nothing to do with them, and even offered to help the enemies of the Jews. This behavior generated deep distrust, leading to the perception that the Samaritans were opportunists, ready to switch sides depending on the circumstances. And this attitude was not limited to words. Historically, the Samaritans allied themselves with both the Greeks and the Romans during times of crisis for the Jewish people, always with the goal of preventing Jerusalem and the Temple from being restored as the spiritual heart of Israel. But this duplicity went beyond politics. Josephus reports that the Samaritans also manipulated their religious identity according to the context. When it was advantageous, they presented themselves as faithful followers of the laws of Moses. But when things became complicated, they reverted to practices and beliefs that distanced them from Judaism. This duplicity reinforced the narrative of betrayal that the Jews associated with the Samaritans. To the Jews, the Samaritans were seen as a people who were never sincere in their conversion, always ready to betray their roots in the name of political or social convenience. In response, the Samaritans saw the Jews as arrogant, refusing to acknowledge the legitimacy of their faith and practices. Over time, this cycle of distrust turned into an unbridgeable chasm. It was no longer just a matter of who worshipped where, but of who deserved to be considered the true heir of God's covenant. The conflict between these two peoples, fueled by centuries of disputes and resentments, became a war of identities, with each side trying to delegitimize the other. Thus, Josephus's accounts show us how this rivalry was not just a religious or territorial issue. It was a battle for recognition for the right to claim the title of chosen people. A battle that, in Josephus's words, the Samaritans waged with a mask of convenience, changing sides whenever it suited them. Even after centuries of conflicts and divisions, the Samaritans have managed to preserve some of their traditions to this day, making them one of the oldest and most unique religious groups in the world. But what remains of this community that was once so significant in numbers and influence? Today, the Samaritans still live in Israel, mainly divided between two locations: Kiryat Luza on Mount Gerizim and the city of Holon near Tel Aviv. Despite being a small group with around 150 families, they continue to uphold practices that date back to biblical times. Perhaps the most iconic tradition they keep alive is the Passover sacrifice on Mount Gerizim. Every year during the biblical Passover, Samaritan families gather on Mount Gerizim to perform the lamb sacrifice exactly as described in the Torah. They wear white tunics, sing ancient hymns, and follow a ritual that, according to them, has remained unchanged since the days of Moses. For the Samaritans, this practice is not just a religious celebration, it is an act of resistance, a statement that their faith has survived despite challenges and persecutions over millennia. For them, Mount Gerizim remains the holiest place on earth, the true location chosen by God to be the center of worship. By performing the sacrifice there, they reaffirm their conviction that they are the guardians of the authentic faith, regardless of how small their community may be. But preserving these traditions is not easy. Over the years, the number of Samaritans has drastically declined. They face modern challenges, such as marrying within such a small community, which has led many to seek spouses from outside, a practice that, for generations, was unthinkable. Additionally, the struggle to maintain their identity in a rapidly changing world threatens their continuity. Even so, the small Samaritan community endures, holding tightly to their traditions, determined to pass on to future generations the faith and practices they believe to be the original heritage of the people of Israel. While the world around them moves forward, they continue to ascend Mount Gerizim, following a path laid out thousands of years ago, with the same determination as their ancestors. Seeing this tradition survive is like looking through a window into the past, where ancient history still lives in the present within a small group that refuses to let its flame extinguish. For the Samaritans, each sacrifice is more than a ritual. It is a declaration of survival, a living proof that even though they are few in number, their faith remains as steadfast as it has always been. The history of the Samaritans is a testament to resilience and survival, but also to deep divisions that have spanned the centuries. As we reach the end of this journey, we understand that the relationship between Jews and Samaritans was marked by rivalries, religious disputes, and conflicting views on who truly upheld the authentic faith of Israel. Today, what remains of this ancient community is a fraction of what it once was, but their presence still carries the weight of a history full of twists and perseverance. Most of the conflicts between the two groups are in the past, but the scars still remain, and Mount Gerizim, the sacred heart of the Samaritans, stands as a symbol of this long-standing dispute. Though the modern world has relegated them to a small footnote in history, the Samaritans continue to perform their rituals, preserve their texts, and maintain their beliefs, passing them down to the few descendants who remain. They are, in a way, an echo of a distant time, a living reminder of how religious and cultural differences can shape the destiny of a people. But the question that lingers is, what does the future hold for them? In an increasingly globalized world, will this small community be able to preserve its traditions for more generations? Or will they, like so many other cultures, become merely a historical memory? The legacy of the Samaritans teaches us a valuable lesson about identity and faith. They represent the struggle to keep a belief alive, even when everything around them changes and adversities seem insurmountable. In the end, the story of the Samaritans is a reflection on the power of tradition and perseverance, a reminder that even the smallest groups can have a lasting impact on the broader narrative of humanity. And so, with each sacrifice on Mount Gerizim, each ritual upheld with devotion, they continue to exist, not as a forgotten page in history, but as a people who never stop believing that the path they chose is the true one, no matter how lonely that path has been.